Well, weekend's rugby is upon us. Irish team has been named. Our coverage, as ever, of the Autumn Nations series here on Indo Sport is brought to you by Energia. Energia sponsors rugby in Ireland at all levels. At grassroots, there is, of course, the Energia AIL. They are the official energy partner to Leinster, Connacht and the Irish men's and women's teams. And I'm sure you're aware as well of the Energia Rugby for All initiative, which very much supports inclusion and gives a welcome to everyone of all abilities to participate in the game. To learn more about Energia's rugby partnerships and their exclusive home energy offer for rugby fans, you can visit energia.ie/rugby. Once again, Cian Tracey of the Irish Independent here in studio. Strepsil just eaten. Hello, Cian.
Hello, Joe.
And very happy to welcome in Mr. Felix Jones. He is BBC's rugby union correspondent, commentator, interviewer, podcaster. What don't you do? How are you?
David Brent, entertainer, friend.
You're a vibes man.
It kind of covers it. Good to be on. How's it going, Joe? How you keen?
Hey, Chris.
So, have you had a good November, Chris? What are you focusing in on? England, I guess, in the main.
Yeah, I mean, I did Ireland and New Zealand over in Dublin, kind of first or second weekend. You know, it was obviously the quieter first weekend, and then that weekend really exploded. I think the autumn's been awesome. I mean, I think given that these games sometimes are, you know, they're glorified friendlies, aren't they? I know the Nations Championship's coming in a few years, but I think there's been a level of kind of jeopardy to all the matches. I think the Aussies being strong has changed the whole complexion of the month because it's another Southern Hemisphere superpower that we didn't really expect. I think the fact that New Zealand have been getting better all the time has made it really gripping. And you know, normally there's the narrative of, oh, it's the end of a season for the South and the North should be that little bit fresher, but instead we've got the opposite narrative, which is that the Southern Hemisphere team seem really to be in their groove and the Northern Hemisphere are still finding their feet. So I think from a kind of holistic point of view, if that's not too worthy a word, I think it's been a brilliant month so far and there's loads more to come.
Yeah, this weekend coming. So on Friday night, if you're planning out your weekend, France will take on Argentina, which is a very interesting game, I think. At 3:10, Andy Farrell's rung the changes for Ireland against Fiji on Saturday. South Africa, Wales, best of luck. Wales, that's going to be painful, I think. And then Italy, New Zealand, 8:10 on Saturday evening. And then Eddie Jones is back at Twickenham with Japan on Sunday. And Scotland will take on team of the moment in many senses, Australia. So that's the weekend forthcoming. We'll just start with Ireland if we could for a second, Chris. We'll go around the houses a little bit. But Andy Farrell has named team. Jean de Villiers, interestingly, in a podcast in South Africa, was talking about Ireland, and he said, we're kind of witnessing an end of an era with Ireland, all those guys retiring. We're seeing now with Farrell the same as what we saw with Eddie Jones, the inability to introduce young players to the squad. Maybe in the next year or two we'll see some younger guys, but it feels like Farrell does not back the youngsters yet. So that was an interesting perspective from afar. Well, he's backed a couple of youngsters for Saturday. So two debutants. Gus McCarthy at hooker has had a stellar rise here, and then maybe a bit more signposted. Ulster's Cormac Izuchukwu at 6. So the team is Jamie Osborne, as he did during the summer in South Africa. He steps in for Hugo Keenan. So Osborne is at full back. We have Mac Hansen retaining his place on one wing. Jacob Stockdale in from the cold. Good form this season. Memories of 18 are still there. So he starts. Robbie Henshaw moves to 13. Bundy Aki comes back in at 12. Those two, of course, know each other very well. The boy wonder, Sam Prendergast, starts at 10, and he'll have Craig Casey alongside him. And then the front row is Andrew Porter. Gus McCarthy makes a debut at hooker. Finlay Beelum is at 3. The second row, Tyke Byrne goes to second row. Joe McCarthy is alongside him. And then debut for Cormac Izuchukwu at 6. Josh van der Fleer at 7, Caelan Doris at 8. Beside him, lots of experience either side of the two debutants, which is a kind of very Andy Farrell thing to do. And replacements, Ronan Kelleher, Tom O'Toole, Thomas Clarkson, Ian Henderson back in. I'm sure he's keen to prove a point. Cian Prendergast on the bench, Conor Murray on the bench. Kieran Frawley is on the bench. I'm sure he'll get game time. And Stuart McCluskey as well. So, Cian, that's an interesting team.
Yeah, to say the least. Definitely more changes than what I was expecting, Joe. I asked Andy Farrell after the Argentina game last week, and certainly the sense was that it wouldn't be wholesale changes, but I think it's brilliant to see the changes that he's made, to be honest. I make it 7 in particular, with 2 positional switches for Robbie Henshaw going to 13, and Tyke Byrne moving from the back row into the second row. And you kind of touched on it there, Joe, that he has put experience around the younger, fresher faces, we'll say. I'm a little bit surprised that Andrew Porter is playing, and I'm kind of contradicting myself. Cian Healy isn't in the squad. We were fully expecting him to break the caps record this week. Now, maybe Andy Farrell will shed some light on that in his press conference, but it's interesting that Tom O'Toole is the one who's covering Loosehead. Obviously, he plays tight head for Ulster, but this is something that Ireland have been keen to do. Gus McCarthy, like, the rise has been phenomenal, really. A bit like Tom Clarkson last week, he hasn't even officially been added to the squad officially. He's been just in as a training panellist. He captained Ireland to a Grand Slam last year. He captained the Ireland under-20s to a Grand Slam. He is really highly thought of in Leinster. Leinster do this thing, Joe, where they always have an academy player in their leadership group, and Gus McCarthy is that guy. He was captain in school of a Blackrock Senior Cup winning team. He was captain of the Ireland under-20s. So his rise has been amazing, really. This is a big step up for him, but look, he's got Porter and Beelum on either side. Like you touched on, Cormac Izuchuku a little bit more flagged. Particularly, you look at his performances for Ulster. I think pretty much since Richie Murphy came in, actually, at the tail end of last season, I think he is better suited to the back row. I remember
it's Murphy who's identified that, really.
Yeah, and like ahead of the Emerging Ireland tour, where himself and Sam Prendergast were clearly being readied for November. I think I'm right in saying that Simon Easterby had kind of said that they were looking at him as a second row. And look, it's brilliant to be able to have that versatility. Ryan Baird has it as well, but I much prefer him in that back row. And again, look, it makes sense, I suppose, to pair him with Caelan Doris and Josh van der Fleer. I actually thought Andy Farrell might look to enhance the depth chart there behind Josh van der Fleer, because I think we're potentially sleepwalking into a problem there, just because Josh van der Fleer's, I suppose, durability and his quality, but we're still not sure who the backup 7 is. Cian Prendergast is on the bench, and look, Andy Farrell tends to team weeks, and I would imagine especially that it's not going to be Cian Healy's big record-breaking day. I would say a big theme behind the scenes this week is that the 2 Prendergast boys are in the matchday squad. Like, what a special moment for their family. Cian actually presented Sam with his jersey last week, and apparently was very emotional, said like some really nice words. His family were there, so I would say that's going to be a big driver for this week. Great to see Craig Casey back in. I thought he was very unlucky to be left out of the All Blacks game after what he did in South Africa. Sam Prendergast we can probably get on and talk to separately, I guess. I think it's no surprise that Bundy Aki is back at 12, I have to admit, because if there's one area of the game where you kind of where it's still developing, is Sam Prendergast's defence. And look, the Fiji team, they've named like a heavyweight midfield combo. Joshua Tuisova is playing 12. You can imagine that he is going to be coming straight down that 10 channel, and I think having Bundy Aki there alongside Sam Prendergast will offer huge reassurance. And Jamie Osborne, again, another guy who was unlucky not to be in the starting team, I think, for either of the first 2 games this month, was brilliant in that second test win in Durban over the summer. And yeah, like, really nice to see Jacob Stockdale back in the team. Look, James Lowe is quite durable as well, so the amount of opportunities that Jacob Stockdale is going to get, I think, are pretty limited. But if he has a big game this weekend and builds on his strong early season form, like you said, Joe, that'll put him right back into the mix. So plenty to get stuck in there. The bench is interesting too.
Yeah, because Chris, all coaches, I think, at international level are always under pressure to throw the young kid in, throw someone in. We want something new. We want something exciting. We want revolution, not evolution. I think, in fairness to Andy Farrell, I always feel he does a very good job of maintaining competitiveness, on not just throwing baby out with bathwater, but he does give plenty of guys their head, and he's done that again here against Fiji. I mean, you're not going to do it against New Zealand. That's understandable.
Yeah, but it's interesting when you mention New Zealand, because I think something they got so right over the years was being able to blood people into a winning team. And you suddenly would blink and they had a load of experience. So someone like Sam Cane was backing up Richie McCaw. He'd never start the big games, but he'd suddenly have 30, 40 caps. And another thing, just looking at the New Zealand team that played against Ireland, not that, New Zealand's the shining light of international rugby. They've had a tough time this year and at times over the past few years, but they rarely carry a player past sort of 32, 33 at the moment. I know they did in 2015, they had that core, but it's interesting, Sam Cane at 32, I think one of the oldest people on tour. This is his last game for the All Blacks. So you can't group everyone who's over 30 together. And I'm sure we all made the mistake with Johnny Sexton of thinking that he was coming towards the end of his career and suddenly he's still going at 38. But it's just been interesting sort of looking from the outside in at Ireland and someone who's as good as Bundy Aki at 34. And I know he's been really well looked after, doesn't play a great deal of provincial rugby. It just, a couple of clunky performances just lead to these kind of questions. And I wonder whether Farrell is thinking of that. And I wonder if Farrell's master plan would have been to do this kind of squad transition a bit more next summer when the Lions were on, all his marquee names were away with him in Australia, and Simon Easterby could take a younger group on tour. And maybe with the performances this autumn, even though they've not been terrible, if they don't go so well the next 2 weekends, will there probably be more change in this squad for the Six Nations, or certainly change a little bit ahead of time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we'll never know to what extent the average performances have impacted on Farrell's thinking. Cian, it may have brought the overall plan forward a touch. I guess you have a bad game at 34, you're finished. You have a bad game at 28, you had a bad game.
Well, I think it even brought it forward into the Argentina game with Sam Prendergast being on the bench last week, because I would imagine that this game has been the one where he was earmarked, but obviously Kieran Frawley had a tough day against the All Blacks when he came off the bench. But it's brilliant to see Frawley back on the bench as well. I thought it was pretty harsh, if I'm being honest, that he was totally bombed out for last week. So he's on the bench, and yeah, I wonder if it has pushed Farrell, Joe, because in the past, when Andy Farrell has tended to make this many changes, it hasn't been great in terms of the fluidity, the cohesion of the team. And ironically, actually, one of the games that stands out the most is the 2022 Fiji game, the last time Fiji were here. Now, Ireland, in the end, won pretty well on the scoreboard, but Fiji were down to 13 men at one point. And Farrell was really, I would say, pissed off after that game with the fact that guys just didn't step up and take their opportunity. And it ended up costing a couple of them haven't really been seen since. Joey Carberry probably the case in point. Now, we know he got injured in that game, but there was a lot of talk about how he ran the week or didn't run the week very well this week or that time. So that's a big opportunity for Sam Prendergast. How has he been behind the scenes all week? They put him up for media on Tuesday, and look, I would have covered him at the under-20s as well and spoken to him a couple of times. Like, you couldn't but be impressed with the confidence that he carries himself with. And I would point out that it's not an arrogance. It's just a real confidence in his own ability. I don't know, for anyone who doesn't know, it's probably worth giving a bit of background to him. His parents were both served in the army. He lived over in Syria for a while when he was younger, while his dad and mum were serving. And he is just such a grounded, level-headed guy. So I can understand why Ireland are really excited about his potential. And obviously Jack Crowley isn't in the 23 this week, but I would say that was part of the wider plan, as opposed to Jack Crowley, I don't know, paying the price for his couple of errors last week. But the narrative that's developing around Sam Prendergast is fascinating, really, because we spoke about this in the post-match pod on Saturday. It's Andy Farrell is the one who's really driving this. I know a lot of people tend to think that it's the media blowing up Sam Prendergast, and look, he is a very exciting talent, but it's Andy Farrell is the one who's really accelerating his growth. And you would just hope it's not to the detriment of someone like Jack Crowley, who's still only 24. I think people are thinking he's 34 maybe, and at the tail end of his career. But the fact he's not in the squad, like I said, I don't think is a reflection of last week. I would still expect Jack Crowley to be starting next week against Australia. But the way Farrell is going about trying to basically fast track Sam Prendergast is really very interesting, considering how little evidence we've seen. Now, obviously, we're not privy to what's going on behind the scenes, but training is no measure, I think, for test match rugby. So a big opportunity for Sam Prendergast this weekend, because look, Andy Farrell has shown time and time again his eye for talent. So who am I to doubt that? And I think, look, there is no question that Sam Prendergast the potential is enormous, but I think at the moment it's still potential. We haven't seen, enough yet. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he does. Like I said, he lit up the under-20s and he is very exciting.
Chris, give us the outside view on Ireland. We were dreading a post-World Cup hangover, the heartbreak. We thought we might go the way of France, who couldn't get themselves going at all. We did just fine, albeit ambush at Twickenham. And then South Africa lost the first test. Farrell disgusted with the aggression and the body language and gave them all a good kick out the backside, and they came out and they won the second test. So drew 1-1 in South Africa is no mean feat. And then you said you were at the New Zealand game, and we weren't obviously impressive in the second half against Argentina. So as with any rugby nation and media, we are navel gazing and going through every moment in microscopic detail, and maybe a good outsider to just give us the overview might be no harm.
I think it's a hard team to get a read on, even though they've been number one in the world for parts of the year, because I've been at a lot of Ireland's games. I was in Marseille when, like you say, Joe, I think people thought France, Friday night, amazing atmosphere on the south coast, away from Paris, a chance for, a rugby mad area to get behind the national team. Ireland without Sexton, World Cup hangover, and then Ireland were awesome that night. I actually think Ireland were I thought Ireland were fine at Twickenham. They probably get stick because they lost that game, but it was almost a pretty handy smash and grab against England team that were really on it. The performance for me that I didn't think much of was actually the Scotland game. It was the game that they clinched the Six Nations, but it was a bit of a flat atmosphere. Scotland Scotland haven't won in Dublin in ages. They had to win by a certain number of points. Ireland were going to always win that title. They didn't have any fluency to their game. They struggled to put Scotland away. Scotland hung in there well, but Ireland had the most of the game. So if you looked at that performance, England performance, first test South Africa, New Zealand, there's a bit of a rap sheet. On the flip side, two unbelievable marquee performances, Marseille and the win in South Africa, like great Irish rugby performances. So of course this team has still got it in it to be world beaters. Look at the players on the pitch. Look at the coaching staff. They're still an outstanding group. It's that consistency, and it's the style, and it's their phase play, and whether it's a slick without Johnny Sexton, whether they're quite winning the game on like they did, and whether their discipline or lack of is a sign that they're just not feeling as comfortable in their own skin as they were in 2022 and 2023. And that's the challenge for this group, isn't it? They've been so good for so long. How do you keep regenerating it, both in terms of personnel and style, to make sure they don't kind of have that fall away like they did the last time Ireland had a dominant side, which was 2018, and then we know how 2019 went. It was a bit of a drop, and then 2020 was another underwhelming year as Farrell found his feet. So it was kind of 2 years of underachievement after a fantastic time. So that's the real challenge for Ireland, isn't it? To make sure that they can continue their levels, even though they won't hit the heights of New Zealand 2022, because that was a once in a kind of generation series win. It's how to make sure they don't suddenly start to slip off like they have done in the past when they've been so good.
Yes, that's all fair. I mean, I think there is going to be some slippage. This is a new cycle in a sense. There's regeneration at play. We're a distance out from the World Cups. I think there is going to be a little.
Farrell going to the Lions? How does that impact things? Because we've got no Warren Gatland's had such a stranglehold on this Lions job going back 15 years. So we have no experience, kind of as followers of Home Nations rugby, about a new Lions coach and what it's going to be like with Farrell. Moving on after this autumn temporarily. We
don't love it, I have to say. I mean, it's not ideal, especially if a bit of regeneration is required. And funny, Cian, we were on last week with Eddie O'Sullivan, who once upon a time might have been thinking about being in the mix for that 2009 tour. And Eddie sort of agreed with the premise of Cian's question when he said, well, look, in modern day rugby and technology and all the software to watch games, I don't think you need to take the Six Nations off anymore, but it just seems to be the way it is. So it's the way it is.
Yeah, and I think...
I could... Yeah,
sorry, Chris. I think just... We touched on this as well with Eddie, the sort of the narrative that Farrell has been coming out with, that, Ireland aren't South Africa, they're not New Zealand, they're not England in terms of the player pool that they have. The timing of that, to me, is very interesting, because he only has 2 more games before he heads off on the line. So it's kind of up to Simon Easterby to pick up the pieces, I guess, for want of a better term. So... all of that is going on in the background. And yeah, look, again, we talked about it with Eddie. I do think it's a bit mad in this day and age that he has to miss the Six Nations. I think a lot of it is optics and it's tradition, but there's nothing to say the traditions can't change.
Would you agree, Cian, though, we are headed for just a little bit of a dip or a bit of stagnation, or just there's a regeneration that needs to happen, and that's going to have some growing pains, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think growing pains is a really good way to put it, Joe. But I would go back to the Argentina game last week. I thought they were excellent in that first half. I have to admit, excellent. They made Argentina a very good Argentina team. I think it's worth pointing out. I don't think a lot of people gave Argentina enough credit, because we saw how good they were in the second half. Now, don't get me wrong, going 48 minutes, I think it was, without scoring, again, while Jack Crowley was off the pitch, and what was it against New Zealand, 36, 38 minutes, I think, as well. Again, while Jack Crowley was off the pitch. That's a worrying trend in itself, but that is a very good Argentinian team coming off the end of a very good year in the Rugby Championship. So I think we should, without pressing the panic button, give them their dues as well. Chris touched on the tour next summer. Look, I know it hasn't been confirmed officially yet, but the word is that Ireland will be playing Georgia, potentially Portugal, and Romania have been mentioned as well. And that is going to be, for all intents and purposes, a development tour. You'd imagine Ireland are going to have a huge bulk of the Lions squad under Andy Farrell, depending on obviously how the Six Nations goes. And that will be another opportunity, I guess, to enhance the depth chart. We were talking to John Fogarty, the scrum coach, earlier this week. The reliance on, like Andrew Porter, I touched on it earlier, is deeply concerning. I mean, they're gone to the stage now where they're trying to switch a tight head over to loose head in Tom O'Toole, which obviously isn't ideal. They've had Jack Boyle, who's a 21-year-old, 22-year-old Leinster prop in a training panellist. He obviously hasn't made the jump up like Gus McCarthy has. So, look, that's obviously going to fall on Simon Easterby. The Six Nations will be full metal jacket as always, but next summer will be another really good opportunity to sort of turn the page a little bit. And if that does mean that there's growing pains, now granted, like, they're not playing elite opposition next year, but if that means there's a few growing pains to get to where they want to get, then so be it. I don't know how well Farrell's comments about the level of talent in Ireland will have gone down with people behind the scenes who were working their asses off really to try and produce young players. And we touched on it, Joe. You look at the success of the Ireland under-20s over the last couple of years, has been amazing. It's just about trying to get them enough game time, and that's why they've introduced the Emerging Ireland Games. The Interprovincial A Championship is starting tonight or tomorrow night, Friday night. Now granted, look, that's far away from the bright lights of Test rugby, but the IRFU are trying to come up with different ways to get game time. I think Ireland A are playing England A. I think I'm right in saying, Chris, during the Six Nations next year as well. So it's not like they're standing still and going, okay, well, we don't have the players. I think it's a little harsh, I think, for Andy Farrell to come out like that. But the fact he's doubled down on it means that he is seriously concerned about it. But next year, I think, will tell a lot, Joe, because by the time we get to this time next year, November internationals, you would be hoping that the depth chart across the board has been enhanced, particularly by that tour next summer.
Yeah. Do you not think, guys, that every international head coach could come up with something to say why their system isn't perfect? A South Africa head coach could say, yes, we've got 1 million players, but they play all around the world because the rand's not strong enough to keep them at home. Likewise, the New Zealand coach could go, we're getting threats from Japan, and we, don't have a strong enough currency or scene to be able to keep or continue with our policy. Australia, competitive landscape. France, still massive influence, top 14 clubs. England, the model isn't ideal. I mean, Ireland have a centrally contracted model and an unusual level of professionalism coming out of their schools, and the private money in Dublin is firing up the Ireland team to some extent. So yes, where Farrell's getting at. Ireland hasn't got the biggest population, it's a competitive sporting landscape, but there's still quite a lot going for an Ireland head coach as well.
It's phenomenal. And to be fair to Farrell, actually, and understandably, the more negative aspect of his message sounded it far louder than the more positive. But he did say in the same breath, he said, well, your greatest strength can also be your greatest weakness. So we don't have a huge playing population, but that's also our greatest strength because, 12 of my starting 15 on a given day are all playing together week in, week out for Leinster. So we've got so much familiarity with each other. So it definitely wasn't a woe is me, Irish rugby's in a bad state. He was more just defending the kind, again, that would you not, can we not give people more debuts or a bit more regeneration? And he was like, well, look, I'm not throwing people in if they're not ready. We don't have thousands of players, and on it went. But obviously, that looks like a big headline of we have no players.
And I think and I'm not suggesting that you're saying it, Joe, because the narrative is out there that he doesn't, blood enough players quick enough. But I think that's unfair as well. If you were to look back at the core of the team, now look, granted, you do have guys like Bundyaki who were there, really important. But you look at Craig Casey starting in South Africa over summer. I know Jameson Gibson Park was injured, but the easy thing would have been to start Conor Murray in that game. You look at Jamie Osborne playing fullback. No one saw that coming. You see Sam Prendergast now as being fast track. Gus McCarthy, Cormac Izuchuku. Yeah. There's been loads of guys that he's been trying to get Ryan Baird game time as well. So the narrative that Farrell isn't replenishing and recycling the team isn't fair. Isn't fair at all. Yeah. Look, fans want to see the next big thing playing constantly. Particularly if things don't go well on a given weekend. But 7 changes for a test match, 2 positional switches, far more changes again on the bench. I don't think you can ask for much more than that. And if the players don't deliver this weekend, like I said, then Farrell can come back just as he did a couple of years ago and say, well, look, that was your opportunity. Because, look, I think another one of the good things, Joe, about Farrell's tenure is that he's never handed out cheap caps, and he's made a point of that as well. You have to earn your place in the team. So if a player is playing brilliant against the Dragons or Zebra, no disrespect to either them in the URC, that doesn't translate to test match rugby. And Farrell wants, if you're a young player, you to be in the group, if it's as a training panellist, if it's going on an emerging Ireland tour, if it's like Sam Prendergast and Cormac Izuchuku, who went to South Africa with the senior squad and didn't play. But that's all part of making sure that they're ready to step up when they are, rather than throwing them into the deep end. So I think he does a lot of good work that supporters maybe are quick to forget.
I think so. Bench against New Zealand, a little conservative for sure, but I think in the main, it's very hard to fault Andy Farrell. We almost need to take a step back and say things are very good. Let's, Chris, go a little bit around the houses. So Eddie Jones is back at Twickenham. Come to Eddie and Danny Kerr's book and all that business in a second. An interesting segue. I want to touch a bit about Marcus Smith. Who at the moment, Chris Jones, is Andy Farrell's number 10 next year in Australia?
Oh, man.
Sam Prendergast.
Sam bloody Prendergast is who?
Well,
Is the correct answer.
I think it's ridiculously open. The one who's got the kind of pedigree and experience, been on a Lions tour couple really, is Finn Russell. Then it comes back to how the Lions are going to want to play. I think the fly half situation all across the home nations is so interesting. You know, you guys are having the constant conversation about Sexton's long-term replacement. Does there need to be a long-term replacement? Is it Crowley? Is it Frawley? Is it Prendergast? Wales are chopping and changing their 10s. They can't settle on one. England have settled on one in Marcus Smith, but I would still pose the question, if George Ford had been fit enough to go to New Zealand, would he have started those test matches? And then Marcus has played so well that it's hard to try something else. Steve Borthwick's got himself into a bit of a fix over when he brings Ford on. He brought him on 64, Marcus Smith against New Zealand, moved Smith to fullback against Australia, didn't bring him on at all against South Africa. So there's lots going on in the England 10 position. There's still Finn Smith in the background that people think is probably the best all-rounder going forward. But Marcus Smith has done so much this autumn that he's owning that shirt as things stand. I honestly think it is completely open. But there will be Scotland fans who go, well, obviously it's Finn Russell's because he's the one who's got the miles on the clock, has been on the Lions tour and has done it for the longest amount of time out of all the contenders, apart from maybe a George Ford, who is only going to get on that Lions tour if he's playing for England, you'd imagine, in the Six Nations.
So tell us more then about Smith. Tell us about you say he's playing well, so put some meat on the bones of that, you know, Smith producing more of these moments for England, but then also that nagging sense at the back of your mind that there are talented 10s and there are test match 10s and 10s that steer your team to victory, and George Ford off the bench, for instance, as you mentioned. So Smith is a very interesting case.
It's such an interesting case. It's a fascinating conversation because, you know, I've worked with people who have, you know, we've covered Scotland games and they've gone, Finn Russell is awesome, but is he that kind of Johnny Sexton, you know, Owen Farrell, Dan Biggar type 10? Now, people would argue, no, he's better than all of them. But in terms of final 20 minutes of matches, you know, it's often spoken about that Finn hasn't won a trophy since the Pro 12 title or 14 title of almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years ago come 2025. So it's a really, really good point because Marcus Smith has been excellent, but all of his excellence has come almost through his own individual brilliance, not as part of a system. And you feel that Marcus is not the fly half that Steve Borthwick envisaged when he took the job, or the game plan that Steve Borthwick had at Leicester, the kind of money ball, pressure game, kicking game, territory game that Steve Borthwick certainly implemented in his first year. Marcus Smith doesn't fit that game very well. Now, can Marcus continue to adapt his game to become this kind of Dan Carter superstar that can do it all, can have a running game, and then as he matures, become more of a quarterback who's going to sit a bit deeper, play the corners and get the team over the line? But there'll be England fans who would go, well, how can you even doubt Marcus Smith? It's not doubting Smith per se. It's doubting what kind of team England want to be. And do they put all their chips and double down on Marcus Smith and come up with a game plan and a strategy that gets the best out of him? or do they want a more of a structured game that would suit George Ford or Finn Smith?
And where do you think where do you think they will go?
I mean, I think they're gonna persist with Marcus Smith for now, but I wouldn't be surprised if England lose a couple in the Six Nations, whether there's still a change.
Okay.
Because or you go Steve Borthwick, and we might be pigeonholing him because he would argue, oh look, these are the tries that the team scored when I was at Leicester. These are the tries that the team scored in the Six Nations. But that kind of attacking revolution that happened middle end of the Six Nations came as a bit of a surprise. A lot of it was driven by Alex Mitchell at number 9, and George Ford was the starting 10. So I think this autumn has thrown up more questions than answers when it comes to England. They'd love to have kicked on from New Zealand, taken a few big scalps, and really continued this momentum the Borthwick project was gathering over the first half of 2024. But instead, there are questions over what kind of team they want to be, their identity, both in attack and defence, tactically, systemically, structurally, their leadership, their ability to execute the final 20 minutes, their conditioning. All of this has been under the microscope, which is really the last thing that Borthwick would have wanted, having things look pretty settled and stable coming back from New Zealand.
Okay. Like competitive in all these games, just coming out the wrong side of them is the short version. Tell me this, you're a well-connected man. What happened with Felix Jones in England?
Do you know what? I've been on a few Irish platforms that have asked the same thing. And because no one has spoken to Felix directly, it's hard to properly try and put across either his side of things or the England or Steve Borthwick side of things. What I think is clear that he loved working under the Springbok system. He loved working for Rassie Erasmus. He loved the freedom he had under the Erasmus regime. He spent a fair bit of time in Ireland. He was kind of the conduit between European-based players and South Africa. So he was able to go around France and the UK and Ireland and all the South Africans that were posted overseas, especially in Europe. He was able to be their kind of, their point of contact. And I think Erasmus, for all of his idiosyncrasies, I think operated a coaching team where everyone got a bit of freedom and license to do what they needed to do. Now, Steve Borthwick is different to Eddie Jones in a lot of ways, but they do share a common trait in how hard they work their staff and how ruthless an environment it is to work in. And this is, I think quite common knowledge that Borthwick does work his staff hard. Whether Aled Walters leaving was a big factor or just something that tipped Felix over the edge, we're not quite sure. But it's clear that you don't leave a setup after 7 months unless you're not if you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, he didn't want to be part of that setup anymore. And the trouble Steve Borthwick has got is he had turbulence in the backroom team in 2 particular areas: defence when Felix left, and Joel Abd has come in, a guy without any international experience who's currently job sharing as head coach at Oyonnax, has a bit of defence coach experience, but hasn't, he's not a Sean Edwards, a Paul Gustard, or someone who's done multiple jobs at defence coach level. Joel Abd comes in for Felix Jones, and then his conditioning department, which did have 2 guys in it, Aled Walters and Tom Tombleson, now has got 1 who's been there 5 minutes, and Dan Tobin. So their conditioning department is light, and their defence is under the microscope. And those 2 areas on the field, England have been found badly wanting this autumn. Okay. Their defence has gone to pot and has looked kind of in 2 minds half the time, or a lot of the time. And conditioning-wise, they're falling away in the final 20. And Borthwick himself has come out and said the players aren't fit enough, which then it surely would have helped to have an Aled Walters figure in there as the man who's bringing this all together with the club game and international rugby. So actually, Borthwick would have loved, those coaches not to have left. It wasn't the plan. So it doesn't reflect well on the setup that they left. And the fact that that's manifesting itself on the pitch now is leading to conversations like this, which is all at odds with the kind of stability the Steve Borthwick regime was meant to have, and that stability he craved as a direct juxtaposition to the Eddie Jones regime.
Yeah. Well, Eddie Jones back at Twickenham on Sunday with an experimental in-transition Japanese side. So England should win, really. Danny Care's book was interesting, if not surprising. You know, like, it was just, it's like, what could you imagine? The only shock would have been if Danny Care's book had come out and said, "You're all wrong about Eddie Jones. He's a teddy bear."
Yeah, this is the thing. Like, it's they're a great snippet. I obviously know Danny very well, and he's obviously kept a few things up his sleeve for his book, and you can't begrudge him that. But a lot of it is reasonably common knowledge or maybe it's just in rugby circles, and for the audience, it was like, oh wow, this is what it was like. But you know, no one was under the impression Eddie Jones was a shrinking violet. No one was under the impression that the Eddie Jones camp was an easy place to be. Dylan Hartley's come out and said how ruthless and difficult it was. And it's been interesting to see a lot of players like a Johnny May, for example, come back and go, look, yes, Eddie was a tough taskmaster, but we won stuff, especially in those few years, 16 and 17. He did this for my career. So, yeah, I think a lot's been made of it. I think if the RFU suddenly go, oh, we didn't know that was happening, that's disingenuous, because they either knew it was happening or they weren't paying attention. Either way, it doesn't reflect on them particularly well. And yeah, I think it's one of those things. The Borthwick's been in there 2 years now. I think he was a bit alarmed about the environment he inherited, but he's probably had enough time with 2 years and 28 test matches to kind of move on from that Eddie regime and see the Eddie regime for what it was. You know, some great bits, some titles, a great run in the 2019 World Cup, but ultimately a little bit of turbulence and not that sustained, consistent success that maybe you're never going to get under someone who operates the way Eddie Jones does.
Yeah, I think it's an all or nothing approach. But I mean, goodness me, that 19 semi-final performance still looms very large when I think of Jones, as average as the subsequent years.
What a performance!
Amazing, yeah. But then, you know, maybe the downside is apparently he worked them very hard in the week building up to the final, which mightn't have been the smartest thing to do either. So there are all these kind of failings with any.
That was the weirdest thing. That's the weirdest thing about the whole. And I still think about it. The weirdest thing about the whole Eddie Jones tenure was how they performed in that World Cup final and how relaxed the camp seemed in World Cup final week. And the irony of it is, having kept the media at arm's length, actually the media into the camp in that final week, and he kept the same team, which again wasn't Jones, because Jones has always been a bit horses for courses. He would always suddenly change a back row or a midfield for the opposition. And he didn't do it for South Africa. And I don't know whether South Africa were playing a game of cat and mouse a bit, because they'd not played any of their cards all tournament. You know, that Wales semi-final, they just booted the ball, and then they started to play a little bit more in the final. Whatever it might be, I think that's the one that got away, because building up to that final, England were absolutely odds on to win that World Cup, and it didn't happen. I think
the semi-final performance was so good. How could any coach change that team? You just be like, something freakish has happened here. I'm not changing it.
But he changed it between quarter-final Australia and semi-final New Zealand. He changed it from Slade to Tuolangi to bring in Farrell into the midfield and Ford starting. So he wasn't averse to those kind of things. Look, if English rugby had its time again, they do that. You know, South Africa were men possessed that day. Maybe nothing was going to beat them, but they would try and win that World Cup, shake hands with Jones, and then, you know, 4 years. He'd have done the 4 years. And he would have fulfilled his brief. His brief was to do 4 years and bring English rugby back to the top table. And after that final in Yokohama, win or lose, he had achieved his brief. A couple of Six Nations titles, World Cup final. That was his brief for 4 years. And I think in hindsight, it's kind of obvious that it should have stayed as a 4-year brief. But it comes back to the same old issue, guys. The planning, the succession planning when it comes to England head coaches and English coaches, and the link with the Premiership and getting these guys coming through Premiership rugby, international rugby, has been found wanting for absolutely ages. So successive chief execs looked around a bit and go, oh, there's no one to step in. Let's give Eddie another few years.
Making much of England?
I'm just listening to Chris there outline all the problems, and suddenly life feels pretty okay.
We honestly, we just don't know how good we have it. We haven't even touched on Wales.
Yeah, like there's lots in there. Like a couple of points that I would make is that I think overall, like I wouldn't be surprised if this ends in tears for England. Just like it seems like history is slightly repeating itself.
Sorry, I agree. I just don't think Borthwick's making it next World Cup. There's something off with this regime.
And look, Chris obviously deals with him a lot more than I do. But in my limited enough dealings, whenever Ireland are playing England, like I don't know what he's like behind the scenes, but I just don't find him that inspiring. The way he speaks publicly, again, like,
is that deliberate in public, the way he goes on?
I'm not sure. When England were here last year, I'm not sure if you were at the press conference.
I watched it in full. I thought I was like, this is incredible.
He spoke over Owen Farrell, and Yeah, I don't know. I find him very awkward,
Yeah.
I have to admit. And I don't know what he's like behind the scenes. I would like to believe that he's not like that behind the scenes, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends in tears. I know the RFU, if that big new money deal with Allianz Stadium, Twickenham and that, but I don't know what kind of cash is behind the scenes. But if the Six Nations doesn't go well for England, I think he's going to be under enormous pressure, because look, they beat Ireland obviously in the Six Nations this year, but have they really had another statement victory this year? I'm not so sure. And it's the style of rugby that they're playing, and I think Chris is right. They seem to be caught between two stools in what exactly they're trying to be, because I've really enjoyed watching Marcus Smith, I have to say, and it's been really encouraging to actually see him play with a bit more verve like that we see him playing with Quins. But I would say that is just not Borthwick's style at all, and I'm actually surprised that Finn Smith hasn't got more of a look in, because I would say he is much more aligned to, like, he has plenty of strings to his bow, but more of a George Ford type player, and he's been excellent for Northampton, a winning Northampton team as well. So I wonder if we've heard the last of that. But I think there's huge pressure on England going into the Six Nations, because this November has been pretty poor. Talks of a potentially unhappy environment in the background. I think you're seeing the job that Felix Jones did in such a short period of time. And I've heard a couple of the players speaking about how much they enjoyed working with him. Look, Felix is quite an intense guy from what you hear behind the scenes as well. But the job that he did with that English defence, look, they were unlucky to lose in New Zealand over the summer, but you could see the defence was really moving in the right direction, and trying to continue that without having, I suppose, the full insight into the South African way of thinking is bizarre. And now Felix Jones finds himself in a halfway house where he's sitting back home in Dublin and, on gardening leave, or whatever way you want to put it. So it's just a messy situation all around. I don't know if you'd agree, Chris, that the Six Nations is absolutely crucial for Borthwick.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge, because the England fans aren't particularly happy, and I think they're a bit split between going, look, it's coming, but that only works for a finite amount of time, doesn't it? That can't work for 10 test matches in a row. It might be able to work for 5. Look, they're knocking on the door, and you watch patches of this England team play and you go, this is not a bad team, this is a good team, it's got a lot going for it. Some of the rugby they played in that first 20 minutes was super clever. So there's definitely something there. It's not like England teams in the past where you look at it and you just go, everything about this is wrong, it's just a matter of time. It doesn't feel like that, but it feels as if the confidence could get knocked by these narrow defeats, albeit narrow. So I think Sunday's not instructive particularly either way about the direction of travel. It's instructive about their confidence and where they're at in terms of their mentality. And if they, I don't know, Japan have the ability to score a couple of quick tries, then their Twickenham starts getting uneasy. How do the players react to that? That will be when we get a real insight as to how these defeats have affected the mood in camp and the feeling on the pitch, and that kind of composure and confidence. You're right about the Six Nations. I think it's huge, because Borthwick is definitely going to, barring a calamitous day on Sunday, which shouldn't happen. We can have that discussion if it does. Barring that, he's definitely going to lead the team into the Six Nations, but I think there would be an expectation to win at least 3.
Are you guys in Paris? I know you're in Dublin.
No, it's Dublin, then it's home to France, home to Scotland. So actually, it's funny, because the last 2 Six Nations Borthwick's had, he started off with 2 home games, or he started off with home games, Scotland, Italy in 2023, which is as Six Nations starts go, that's gentle. Yeah. And 2024, he started off away Italy, home Wales. Yeah. So he's had some really gentle starts. So he got 2 out of 2 from his second Six Nations, but he'd lost the first one against Scotland in his first game. This time, there's no respite. Ireland away, France at home. Then it's Scotland at home, and then it's Italy at home. So once they get past that, they get the Calcutta Cup at home, which is where they'd rather be as opposed to Edinburgh. And then they get Italy at home and Wales away. So they get the 2 weakest teams last. So yeah, it's a massive Six Nations for Borthwick, because I think if it's another 2 out of 5 campaign, I think the noise around where the Borthwick project is going would be pretty deafening. What I do think is he's got to look at the next few months and go, right, that hasn't worked out that autumn for whatever reason. How do I, get the coaching team aligned? How do I get the strategy and the tactics honed down, and look at the things that have gone wrong? How do I improve the strength and conditioning, given there's still a person light in that team? So the next few months, I think, are absolutely huge. He's got to make kind of almost philosophical, ideological calls over something like the defence. They've had all these test matches, as Cian says, with the South African system. Joel Lab hasn't been coaching the South African system. So is it fair on Joel Abd, who's a rookie coach at this level, to take someone else's defence? Or if you do think he's good enough to be an England assistant coach, which should be one of the most sought after jobs in English rugby, if you think he's good enough, you then have to give him the jurisdiction and the leeway to run the defence the way he wants to run it. But then is that burning 10, 11 test matches where they've been trying to hone a different defence with a short training camp before they go to play Ireland in Dublin off the back of Champions Cup rugby. So yeah, it's just one of those campaigns that's just led to loads more questions. And I think we all thought we would have flying back from New Zealand, where yes, it was 2 defeats out of 3 on that tour, but you really felt the team was gathering momentum, getting an identity and really moving in the right direction.
Okay. Before you go, you are Welsh, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of a bit of both. I have a Welsh dad and an English mum, so my rugby experiences growing up were Welsh, but live in England. So and as a BBC journalist, I'm incredibly impartial as well. So hope that kind of doesn't answer your question.
Yeah,
have you seen him with his half and half scarf now in my head?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, maybe lately you're kind of cashing in the Welsh aspect. I mean, why would you inflict the pain on yourself? So, I mean, Australia put 50 on them last day out. They're 11 consecutive defeats, the worst run in their 143 years. Gatland 6 wins in 23 tests. Everybody from Mike Phillips to their former chief executive David Moffat saying he needs to go. He's obviously in a lot of money. I mean, the kind of sense from outside is golden generation, papered over the cracks, all the cliches about, well, they're just 2 feet bigger in a red jersey. You know, it turns out that was just kind of guff. They just had a really good generation that did paper over the cracks. And now the Manny Failings in Welsh rugby seem to be coming home to roost. And nobody we've spoken to, Chris, sees a short way out of this.
Yes. No, very fair summary, because it's not as if you look at the team on paper and go, that should be beating South Africa this weekend. Whereas a Welsh team on paper 5 years ago, you'd have made an argument for them beating a South African team of 5 years ago, maybe. Yeah. It's a really bleak situation. It's really sad. Yeah, as you said, I've got emotional connections to Welsh rugby. It's given, my old man and family members more joy than you can imagine following Welsh rugby, because it's that feeling of them against the world in the Principality Stadium, and teams with all the minerals, all the kind of players and everything going for them, coming down to Cardiff, whether it's a French team or an Irish team or a Welsh team or an English team, and it doesn't matter when they get up against the Welsh team on a roll. And I think it's made a lot of Welsh people very proud of their country, incredibly proud of their rugby. And if the Welsh team doesn't do that anymore, that's a really sad state of affairs. It does go back a long time. I was thinking about the Civil War of 2013 kind of time, when the WRU and the regions were at loggerheads, and it was almost a case of the WRU being like, here's your money, take it or leave it, threatening them. And you're like, whoever's fault that was, isn't that an insane place to be? How insane is it that you've got the domestic professional sides that provide the players for the national team, and you are at war? And it's that a union that got carried away with the Grand Slams of 08 and 12 and thought, well, actually, the Welsh team will always be fine, because whatever's going on at domestic level, put them in the Vale, put them in the Principality, they grow and they'll deliver. And the top-down approach is fine, because once you put 15 players on the pitch, you only need 15 on a pitch. You don't need all the depth in the world. You only need 15. France and England and South Africa over the years have probably wished the game had 30 players. They've got so many. So I wonder if execs at the WU got carried away with the success and thought it would last forever. And now it's not. And it's ironic that Nigel Walker, who's kind of in charge of all this, said a few years ago in an interview, if the Welsh team doesn't win, the whole game in Wales goes into decline. And it feels in an existential crisis, which is so sad, given Welsh rugby means so much to so many people and has been such an amazing presence on the global stage for so long.
And I suppose the net effect for the Six Nations, Cian, is it's such a delicate ecosystem. I always think it's a miracle the Six Nations is so even, and has been for
it is 100%.
So much of the last 20, 30 years. Like, you say the Six Nations was a soccer tournament for a moment.
Well, look at the women's game.
Or the women's game. It's like the women's Six Nations.
That's an example of where the resources
tournament. Yeah,
make an impact.
Yeah. The players, former players who played for them will concede the current Six Nations. It's an awful tournament. The women's, from a competitive point of view. So, like, Italy are always, I mean, they've shown signs, obviously, but you just worry they'll just always be of a level. But what has made the last 20 years so amazing is on any given day. So, but if Wales are to slide, and then that means, so you probably win your Italy game, then if you're going to probably win your Wales game for the guts of the next decade, then you're down to 3 kind of big weekends. And the Six Nations was always 4 massive weekends, and you could live with Italy. So it's potentially very serious for the championship.
I think you could even stretch it beyond the Six Nations in terms of how fine the margins are, Joe, at the very top level. Now, we saw it again against Argentina last week for Ireland, that that there is very little to separate the top teams. I do think South Africa are ahead on their own, but of course, I mean, for just like we want Australian rugby to be strong ahead of the Lions next year, the home World Cup, like, we need Welsh rugby not only for competitive Six Nations but for the URC as well. And obviously, look, since the Scarlets won a few years ago, like, it's just been dire stuff really. And look, Chris has outlined some of the problems there, and I think the Welsh Union are the ones who have a lot to answer for here, because you guys just both touched on the women's Six Nations. Some of the stuff that you're hearing that's coming out about the Welsh women's team as well would just remind you that it's not just the men's side of the house that's been totally sort of left behind here, it's the women's side as well. So that comes from the top down. Gatland is obviously working with, I would say, a very limited bunch. They're just like trying to cling to any sort of young hopefuls like Jack Morgan breaking through, but it's just so difficult for a young player like that to stand out when your team is going backwards. You look at Cam Winnett, who's been playing fullback. I mean, I don't think he'll want to see a replay of that. Was it Lenny Kitau who scored the try last week? So these are the guys that Welsh rugby are clinging to. You don't have your Jamie Roberts, your Sam Warburton, as you said, Joe, but it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. And it is a concern because you need all 6 teams to be competitive in the Six Nations and beyond as well for World Rugby. So you could see it in Warren Gatland's TV interviews last week that he just looks like it looks like a broken man. And does he really need that at this stage of his life? Possibly not. But he said that he would walk away if it wasn't for the betterment of Welsh rugby. But I would say
the salary's good.
The salary is good, of course it is. But I would say, even like, I know Gatland is in flavour of the month with a lot of Welsh supporters, and maybe Chris can give us more of an insight. But I think even Chris, the staunchest Welsh supporter, would say that if you were to get Andy Farrell or Joe Schmidt, whoever, take your pick, at Rassie Erasmus, your top coaches would really struggle to go into that Welsh team now and make a difference, because it's just, you can only work with the players, the old cliche. And you look at how they're playing, Joe, whether it's in the URC or not, they're getting pumped most weekends. So I think it's an impossible job, I think, at the moment. But we could probably still be expecting a little bit more. I thought it was alarming how their defence was opened up last week, seeing a second row, Nick Frost, running through from almost the halfway line. Like, Australia were looking like a vintage All Blacks team all of a sudden last week. And I think a lot of that was, of course, down to Australia, but also the sad state of Welsh rugby. And I think sad is the word. Chris used it a couple of times there. It's sad to see Welsh rugby like this.
Yeah, okay. We got to go. Fellas, who's been your player? Sorry, your favourite player. Forget player, that sounds too official. Who's been your favourite player of November?
Wallace Satiti.
No arguments.
Maybe Wallace Satiti.
Yeah.
And Ardi I think Ardi Sever as well. Wallace Satiti, just because, I mean, Ardi's the reigning player of the year, so he gets enough love. So I'll go for Wallace Satiti.
Yeah, we should put me on the spot here.
Who's our Australian Rugby League convert?
Joseph Swahili.
Oh.
Yeah, it was a shame. Well, it was just as well from a Welsh point of view, I guess, that he didn't start last week. He was great in that England game. I thought it was a joy to watch Juan Cruz Malia live last week. He is like just a Rolls Royce of a player. Toulouse don't tend to sign duds from overseas, and he is class, and his try was brilliant. It's a pity Sasha Feinberg and Gamazulu is injured, because he has been sensational as well. And it's good. Look, I know Jamie Osborne.
They need some more depth, South Africa, don't they?
Yeah, if there's one thing they need, yeah. And I know Jamie Osborne got nominated for obviously Young Breakthrough Player of the Year, but Chris is right. It's going to be between Wallace Satiti and Feinberg and Gamazulu.
That is some head-to-head.
Yeah.
For young
I think all the momentum is with Wallace Satiti now, because Sasha Feinberg and Gamazulu missed a good chunky. He's not going to be playing in November as well, but what a talent he is.
I hadn't seen, I mean, maybe I should have. I just hadn't noticed him until the Irish tour in the summer. And he came off the bench, I think.
Yeah.
What the hell is this?
Look, this is, I know we're finishing, but like just a very quick point, like it speaks volumes to the genius of Rassie Erasmus that he was able to get a coach like Tony Brown in, one of the most sought after attacking minds in world rugby. So while the South Africans are obviously sticking to their DNA in terms of their big forward pack, they're adding wrinkles now on top of that, which I actually think could make them even more dangerous going forward, because you would have said that, look, Andre Pollard is the exact type of 10 that the Springboks need. Unbelievable player, double World Cup winner, but now they're throwing even like Manny Libok, you would say, you know, is a little bit off the cuff, but Feinberg and Galmazulu looks like he is a serious talent, and I think the rest of world rugby will be worried really, because the Springboks look like they're getting better while maybe the chasing pack is falling a little bit further behind.
Yeah. The way when you're describing the kind of confusion and mild chaos, if that's not a contradiction in the English ticket, Chris, and how not quite adding up or making sense, whereas South Africa, it's just like vroom, and they're adding layers and everything's kind of working.
And then they bring in someone like Jerry Flannery, and like Flannery was a bit of a left field pick, because coaching Harlequins' defence is a bit of a tough gig, because they're Kevin Keegan's Newcastle, aren't they? But obviously he's just so clever with who he brings in, the fact that they knew each other from Munster. We went to see Flannery in Jersey. We also spoke to Erasmus at length and Cheslin Colby for our pod, and Flannery was talking about how much he'd spoken to Felix about the environment, and it just everything Erasmus does, and he's done some things that haven't painted him or the Springboks or the game in very good light. They're well documented, but he is on a different level, it seems, in terms of everything he's doing over selection, over rotation, over managing his squad, over those little bits of tactical and technical innovation. I didn't notice it, but Chris Ashton noticed how he had people watching the England warm-up and then ferrying messages back to the coaching box ahead of the game. He had Pollard mic'd up on the bench, giving, he had a game in the summer where Khaleesi's up there with him. He's brought Dwayne Vermeulen into the setup. It's someone who is so comfortable in his role that he feels incredibly empowered to bring people through, and to have 50 players playing through 2024, yet everyone seems completely invested in their role. If you're under Estes and you get told, right, you're not going to play at Twickenham, but go to Edinburgh, play 12 for 80 minutes and beat Scotland. He's like, cool, I'll do that. Everyone seems completely bought in, don't they? And yeah, they are a very, very, very impressive outfit on and off the pitch.
They make great documentaries. I mean, it's just, they're so good.
Yeah.
The flashing lights hasn't caught on.
Great. No, not quite. But they can't all stick.
No.
Yeah.
We're at time. Cian Tracey of the Irish Independent. Thank you, Cian.
Hey, Joe.
And Chris Jones, the BBC's rugby union correspondent. Chris, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
No, great to be on. Thanks for having me. Cheers, guys.
Cheers. And as always, our rugby coverage, our autumn series coverage here in Indo Sport is brought to you by the good people at Energia, and you can check out energia.ie/rugby.